It's good to see everybody here today. Hoping we could have had some more people here, but we do have a visitor with us, so we're glad you came our way and invite you to come back at every opportunity you might have.
Amen.
All right. The lesson we're going to have today is part 2. Last month I did a lesson on what can kill a local church. And so we're going to be talking about part 2 today, and next month we'll get part 3. And for most congregations, all they have to do is continue what they are doing now. And that's going to eventually happen for them. But one reason what can kill a local church is because the members allow it to happen. And that's what we have to realize, that churches die because members allow it to happen. If they were strong, they would not let this happen. So let's get in here. And, in Revelation 3:1, the church of Sardis was described as a dead church. They were still meeting, but God said, you're a dead church. And they continued in their existence, and they didn't know they were dead. And this reveals that churches can die, and they often do, and it also reveals that they can continue on, even though they're dead. And so, where are the congregations we read of in the New Testament? I mean, actually, they all ceased to exist. Now, over time, people did reestablish churches in those cities, but they're not the original. I mean, the original congregations of the New Testament, they all died out in the 2nd century. Some of them even died out in the 1st century, when the great persecution arose against them, which really didn't happen much longer after the church began, Acts chapter 8. And so, but at some point in their history, they died. And we all are probably familiar with many congregations that have ceased to exist. And so, we might be so arrogant to consider that our congregation would never cease operations, but that would be naive. I mean, that would be the wrong thing to say, because, yeah, we have to be mindful of what are we doing to keep this congregation going. We have to work hard at it. I mean, it's not an easy task. We just have to work hard at it to make sure that it does continue to go. All right. So when it comes down to it, we must know that there are reasons congregations died and ceased working together. I mean, it does happen. And so we're going to look at some of those reasons in this study. And there's 2 ways in which a church can die. Well, first of all, they decide, well, we've gotten so small, we'll just sell the building, we'll just get out of our way, and then we'll just decide where to go. Let every member decide which way they're going to go. And so, or it can die inwardly, just like the church of Sardis. Basically, people aren't doing their duty as Christians, and it's just basically a waiting game until the last member dies out. I've seen that with some congregations, and it's really sad to see. And so, even though it continues outwardly, I mean, it's inwardly they are dead. They're actually doing nothing for the Lord. So, when we look at all the reasons, we shall determine that there are some basic reasons that congregations die. And so we want to look at that, and we'll notice that these things are the works of Satan. So he does that. And Satan will try and stop anybody from preaching the truth. Now, Satan doesn't care if people go to church as long as they don't live faithful to God. I mean, that's what it comes down to. And so, that's what they're going to see. This is the work of Satan. All right, are we aware of the different weapons Satan can use to destroy us? I mean, we've talked about this several times. There's quite a few lessons, or quite a few things we learn about Satan and how he tries to employ them against us to turn us away from the truth, keep us away from the truth. Like I said, Satan doesn't care if you go to church, just don't live like you go to church. I mean, that's all he's mindful of. And so, he doesn't mind if you go to the wrong church. He doesn't really mind if you go to the right church, but just don't live like you're supposed to. I mean, Satan's got you either way. And so, are there things that threaten our very existence even now? Well, we have to be aware that there are things that threaten our existence. All right, in these lessons, What Can Kill a Church, we will examine several things that can jeopardize any congregation of God's people. And some of these methods that Satan employs are apparently effective. Some of them are very subtle, but they can still destroy a local church. And so today we're going to look at one of these problems. Now, last time we talked about persecution. Persecution has chased many people away from the church. They just don't want to deal with it, so they just leave the church altogether, and they're going to lose their soul because of it. And so each of these are tools of Satan working to destroy the church. And so future lessons will focus upon other things. False teaching. False teaching has destroyed many congregations. And a lot of our congregations don't even know that false teaching is taking place. And so we're going to talk about, telling outright lies is one thing, and the faithful of the Lord will not put up for that. And I'm saying the faithful of the Lord will not put up with that. Now, the unfaithful, they're okay with that. They don't care if their preacher tells them lies, just so long as they have a feel-good sermon that they feel good about themselves. And so that's what they do. And they don't care if they tell lies. They just want to feel good about themselves. And according to 2 Timothy 4, verse 3 and 4, the time they would not endure sound doctrine, but they wish to have their ears tickled. They will accumulate for themselves teachers of their own desires. And so we know that's going to take place. And so this is not the method that false teachers use when they trying to come into a congregation. They don't use this method of just coming out already and blurting out the lies. Well, they have to, if they're announced that they're a false teacher, people will not listen to them. You know, you watch the TV shows and all of a sudden you see the alphabet soup. They're going in to capture a criminal. You got ATF, you got FBI, you got this alphabet or that alphabet. And they don't have any FT pictures that people wear on their patches or their back. They're not declaring that they're a false teacher. And if they announce, well, I'm going to teach Arab, I'm going to teach y'all Arab, well, they wouldn't want them. And they're not going to take that. So what do? They have to enter by stealth, and approach. That's what false teachers do. First of all, if a false teacher is going to come in and teaches Arab, he's got to know what they expect. And so maybe in the interviews, when they ask him what his stance is on certain doctrines, he gives them what they want to hear. And okay, that sounds good. And then so he gathers these people and he basically starts building up their confidence in him. He'll start off for the first several months, teaching very basic lessons. Oh yeah, good preacher, everything he says is sound and true. But before long, he starts introducing different ideas. And if the congregation's still so enthralled with it, they like him so much, they trust this teacher, then whatever he says must be right. And they don't sit there and evaluate. They don't sit there and go to the scriptures to verify what is being taught. Well, he must know what he's talking about. We trust him. And next thing you know, false teaching is in there. And then many of the members are infected with this false teaching, these false doctrines. And then they start espousing it to others. So this is what they do. They go in, they examine the flock, they can learn the most vulnerable and find the weak ones. It takes time to do that. And that's what they do. And these weak ones are the first ones to be preyed upon. Why? Because they don't have a solid foundation. And we'll see why in just a moment. See, we know from Scripture that ignorance is the greatest tool of a false teacher. No doubt about it. As long as people are ignorant, then they'll listen to it and they'll take it. And if he's persuasive enough, or she is persuasive enough, then they'll go along with that. I mean, Hosea 4:6, my people are destroyed for lack of knowledge. Because you have rejected knowledge, I also will reject you from being my priest. Since you have forgotten the law of your God, I also will forget your children. See, the lack of knowledge is what destroys these people. And we could say, it doesn't matter if they go to church, if they don't study, if they don't learn, then they're vulnerable to all sorts of false doctrine. And especially the doctrines that teach, okay, once saved, always saved. You're saved, okay, you're always saved. And you don't have to worry about losing your soul. Faith only works. The sinner's prayer will let you become a child of God. And they will teach all sorts of false doctrine. Why? Because the people are not grounded in the truth, and they cannot determine the difference between right and wrong. See, the Hebrew writer said the same thing in Hebrews 5. He says, for the time ought to be that you ought to be teachers by now. But you need to be taught again. And so knowing that you have to exercise yourself to discern between good and evil, that's only going to happen if you know what evil is, if you know what good is. So those who know the truth of the Bible can identify false teaching very easily. And the problem is that in many congregations, they have not had a steady diet of honest, truthful teaching. And I get that. I hear all the time from different brethren across the country. Where's all the die-hard preachers that spoke out boldly for the truth? And there's a big question mark. Well, really? I really don't know. What they've decided, we want these preachers to make us feel good, and we'll extol them and give them the praise and honor them. And these people who speak the truth, well, they're just a bunch of negative people. We don't need that kind of negativity in our lives. So they think. See, many members prefer to be fed a diet of sugar-coated, smooth words. See, in Isaiah 30, 9 through 11, for this is a rebellious people, false sons, sons who refuse to listen to the instructions of the Lord, who say to the seers, you must not see visions, and to the prophets, you must not prophesy to us what is right. Speak to us pleasant words, smooth words, prophesy illusions. Get out of the way, turn aside from the path. Let us hear no more about the Holy One of Israel. Now, when it comes down to it, as Paul described these same people there in 2 Timothy 4 and verse 3 and 4, that's exactly what they're saying. We don't want our toes stepped on, so make us feel good. And if that means you have to tell a lie to do that, we're okay with that. And that's what they do. Across this land and around the world, the preachers have heard this cry, and many have caved in and are learning to comply with such requests. Just taking it away. And the less truth you present, the more popular you're going to be according to this world. There was a preacher many years ago who started out preaching the truth. He basically did that, and he started going to larger congregations because he was a good speaker, kept going to larger congregations, and then all of a sudden he decided to write some books. First 2 or 3 books, they were pretty good, pretty sound, sold some copies, and then he realized, if I was to change my teaching, I could sell a lot more books. So all of a sudden he decided to stop teaching that baptism was essential to salvation. He started teaching that. He started teaching that our brothers and sisters in the denominations are just as equal with us. And we're just as right as they are. And they're just as right as we are. He became very popular. And his congregation grew from several hundred to several thousand. And now he's got about 7,000 or 8,000 people in his group. They don't ever hear the truth, but they've got it. And this fellow's name was Max Lucado. You've probably heard that name. He's got like 60 books out now. And about the only books I would recommend of his were the first 3 or 4 that he wrote. He was still pretty much a sound preacher back then, but the popularity and the ego that he had And then he says, oh, we've got to drop the name Church of Christ from our group because Church of Christ turns people off. So he talked his leadership into just dropping the Church of Christ. So now they just call it Oak Hills Church in San Antonio, Texas, and that's it. Preachers have given in. They've caved in to what the people want. And when you give people what they want, they appreciate it and they show their appreciation. When you tell people what they need to hear, like say, you're not going to be a popular person. As a result, many of the faithful are sounding out to cry for the sound teaching that they grew up on. I'm sure many of us, I remember some preachers, they were fire and brimstone type preachers. They laid it out there. They influenced me quite a bit in the way they presented the truth. And it impressed me. And I decided, well, that's what I'm going to do. I'm going to preach the truth. And if people don't like me, that's their problem. They're going to have to answer to God for that. But I cannot turn around and give people this lovey-dovey false teaching. May become popular, but that won't cut it as far as God is concerned. Amen. So as we pointed out earlier, this is just one of the tactics that Satan uses to keep people out of heaven. And this is just one of them. We have an example of the Ephesian church dealing with such error being taught. See, in Revelation 2:2, it says, I know your deeds and your toil and perseverance, and that you cannot endure evil men, and you put to the test those who call themselves apostles, and they are not, and you found them to be false. The next verse, but I have this against you. You've left your first love. So what changed? What caused the Ephesian church to be very sound and strong and faithful and putting down the false teacher, to all of a sudden, who cares anymore? What attitude changed for them? And how long did it take? Well, I don't know how long it took, but the angel that's speaking to John says, you know what, I have this against you. You've left your first love. So the church in Ephesus was commended for withstanding the false teachers, but they had other problems they needed to fix. Just because you deal with one problem doesn't mean that other problems are not going to arise. Satan always has a backup plan, no matter what it is. If he can get some false teaching in here and cause souls to be lost, that's one thing. If we resist the false teaching, well, he's going to find another way. It might be complacency. It might be the persecution we talked about. It might be the apathy and things like that that'll destroy us. See, the church in Pergamos also dealt with false teachers. See, in Revelation 2:13 through 15, he says, I know you dwell where Satan's throne is, and you hold fast my name, and did not deny my faith, even in the days of Antipas, my witness, my faithful one, who was killed among you where Satan dwells. But I have a few things against you, because you have there some who hold the teachings of Balaam, who kept teaching Balak to put a stumbling block before the sons of Israel, to eat things sacrificed to idols, and to commit acts of immorality. Then you also have some who in the same way hold the teaching of the Nicolaitans. Alright, so, yeah, they had problems. Some of them were faithful. They were strong, even with all the persecution coming their way. But some of them had adopted false teaching in different ways. See, Paul warned the Ephesian elders about false teachers. He says there in Ephesians 20, 29 through 30, it should be 1 Corinthians. 1 Corinthians 20, 29 through 30. I'll fix that. See, I know that after my departure, savage wolves will come in among you, not sparing the flock, and from among your own selves men will arise, speaking perverse things to draw away the disciples after them. So even the people that Paul had entrusted to watch out for the flock, he said, from your own midst, some of you are going to turn people away from the Lord. And, we don't know how soon this happened. It probably happened pretty quick. But Paul was right, it did happen. And so, Peter was also warned about the danger of error. In 2 Peter 2, verses 1 and 2. But false prophets also arose among the people, just as there will also be false teachers among you, who will secretly introduce destructive heresies, even denying the master who brought them, bringing swift destruction upon themselves. So we have people today says there's no such thing as a false teacher because you can't know their hearts. Peter said they're going to bring in these doctrines that are false, and so what else are you going to call them? They're false teachers. They're teaching error. Now, and it doesn't matter whether they're trying to do it maliciously or if they're doing it ignorantly. If they're teaching error, they need to be taught the right way. You remember when Apollos was preaching, mighty and bold in the Scriptures, and speaking of the way, only knowing the baptism of John. Well, it was still false teaching, so Aquila and Priscilla took him aside and expounded to him more excellently the way, and the way of Christ. And so, it doesn't matter how great a preacher, flattering words and all might be, if he's teaching the falsehood, he needs to be basically counseled, corrected, or if he won't, he needs to be marked. As Paul said to the Romans, mark those that cause offense, and do not deal with them. See, Paul warned Timothy that there would be a time when people would not endure sound doctrine. We already read that, 2 Timothy 4, 3 and 4. And the remedy was to preach the word, be instant in season, out of season. Reprove, rebuke, and exhort with all long-suffering and doctrine. And always be ready to preach. That's what it means. And that's not talking, he was speaking to a preacher, giving him this instruction, but who should always be ready to preach? You should. Each and every one of you should be ready to preach at every opportunity that you have. Every opportunity means you might be able to say something to someone in the line at the grocery store. You might be able to say something to someone you meet along the pathway. Just acknowledging, isn't this a beautiful day, the day the Lord has made? Just open someone's mind to start thinking spiritual thoughts, and who knows? You might be able to save a soul from death. And if someone you know is teaching something that's wrong, you've got to either correct them. So James talks about the fact that he who does this will save a soul from death. And Jude goes so far as to say, snatch them out of the fire. They're heading in the wrong direction. They're about to enter that fire, and if you can snatch them out, you'll save a soul from death. So that's what we should be doing. Ready to preach all the time. Preachers need to learn to keep the preaching balanced with positive reinforcement, yes, and negative warnings. That's involved in this. 2 Timothy 4, 1 and 2. Reprove, rebuke, and exhort. Two of those are negative, and one of them is positive. And so, you know what? If the members will do those things that they're supposed to do, there won't be much need for the negative, the warnings about not doing what's supposed to do. Problem is, a lot of members, they're not doing what they're supposed to do, and sometimes you step on their toes. The point is that we must beware of popular preaching that does nothing more than entertain and make people feel good. I don't know about you, but I've sat in listening a lot of sermons in my younger days, and by the time the preacher was finished, it did nothing for me. I didn't learn anything. He just sat there. I went one time, and they talked about some preacher elsewhere spent the whole sermon extolling how great this guy was, and never once called people to the Scriptures saying, now let's notice what the Scriptures teach. I've been sat through a lot of sermons where they never opened the Bible to discuss what God's Word says. They come up with other things. And I know of one particular preacher, he was a good friend of mine, but he went approximately 8 weeks in a row and never used the word sin once in any of his sermons. 8 weeks. That's 16 sermons that did not mention the word sin. Why? Because sin's kind of sensitive. People are sensitive to that word. So we don't want to make people feel bad. See, we need preaching that instructs and guides people into the proper motivation to serve God. And yes, the fear of hell is definitely a good motivation. But more importantly, if you have a love for God, that is a greater motivation. So that's what we need to do. See, we must be very careful to not support those who teach error. 2 John 9 through 11 talks about that. Anyone who doesn't abide in the doctrine of Christ does not have God. He who abides in the doctrine of Christ has both the Father and the Son. And if someone comes to you and brings not this doctrine, do not receive them into your home. Do not give them a greeting. For bidding them Godspeed is basically saying you're bidding them well. Don't do that. Even if the brethren stand strong against false teaching, Satan can still use some tactics to draw the people away from God. And so he will use it. If one plan doesn't work, he's going to try another. And if that doesn't work, he's going to try another. Because remember, when we talked about Satan, he never gives up. He never gives up. And that's what we need to know. His whole goal is to keep you out of heaven, and he will use any method that he can to do that. And if he can use weak Christians to influence you to stay weak, then he's won his battle. So there's other tools that Satan will use to kill a church. And he'll never give up. He will always be trying until time ends to keep people out of the church, to keep people from being strong and faithful. And sometimes we look around and we think, well, he's doing a pretty good job right now. We just have to work extra hard to make sure that doesn't happen. See, there are many factors that can kill a church. And we must be resolved to not allow this to happen to us. And that's right. Because if this congregation fails, it's because we allowed it to happen. And so we cannot allow that to happen. So we must be strong in the faith. How are we going to be strong in the faith? We're going to study. We're going to learn. We're going to sit here and encourage one another, all the more as we see the day approaching. And we're going to spend time with each other. And we're going to learn God's Word. And that's what we encourage all of our members to do. Some of our members decide, well, I don't need to go to Bible class. Maybe they have the idea that I already know enough, I don't need it. I mean, whatever the reason. I mean, they're depriving themselves of knowledge. We're supposed to be filled with the knowledge of God's will. And if you never get any knowledge coming in, how can you ever be filled of it? I mean, you just can't. So we all must be strong. Every one of us must be strong in the faith. And we just cannot rely upon a few faithful ones to keep everything going. Which in many congregations, that seems to be the way it's going. So false teaching is bad, but if we allow Satan to keep us from serving God the way we should, he wins and our soul will be lost. So don't let that happen to you. I mean, don't let it happen. Like I say, it's so easy. As we mentioned many times, it's so easy to just give up. It's so easy not to be putting forth an effort. So think about that. I mean, we're going to sing an invitation song. We always do, giving people the opportunity. If you need to find a way to change your ways and get right with the Lord, we encourage you to do that. If you need prayers, we'll be glad to pray for you. And everyone in here has been obeyed the gospel, so we don't have to call you to be baptized. But you know what? When we sit down and examine ourselves, have I lived up to God's standards? And if you think you've fallen short, and if you need prayers, we'll pray for you. So whatever your case may be, we invite you to come all together. We stand and sing.